Hi, welcome back to Frank's Vinyl Review. This week we're reviewing a new release by the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and this one is Jimi Hendrix Experience Hollywood Bowl, August 18th, 1967. This is a complete show release. And interestingly, this was released yesterday worldwide. The interesting thing about this show had not been heard. The recordings were found. Apparently, most of the shows at the Hollywood Bowl were recorded via 2-track recording. So I'm not sure the history of how the recordings were discovered, but just fascinating for Hendrix fans that there are still new recordings being unearthed, if you will. And this is an interesting period in sort of the arc of Jimmy's young career and very short career. As hardcore Hendrix fans know, he only recorded professionally for almost 4 years. But anyway, I want to jump right into some of the context, behind this record. Just so I'm going to talk about what Jimmy was doing in the weeks and months leading up to this show, and this will be new information for newer Hendrix fans, for real hardcore Hendrix fans like myself. It's going to be sort of a redundancy, if you will, but it's still kind of fun to talk about. So when Jimmy arrived back in the United States after spending close to 8 months in Europe. And the first show back, when he came back to the United States, was at Monterey, at the Monterey Pop Festival. Exactly 2 months prior, he was there on the 18th of June in 1967, and just played an incredible set. One of the greatest sets in rock and roll history, really. I mean, and I'm not over exaggerating that. His performance was amazing. Most people know the performance. He set his guitar on fire at the end of the show, and that was sort of the big crescendo. But musically, it was just an incredible performance, both visually as well as sonically. Just an incredible, welcome home, welcome back to the U.S. For Jimmy after being abroad for 8 months, and really establishing his career in England initially, his professional career. Under his own name. So, he played the one gig in Monterey, and luckily Bill Graham saw him, or was at the International Pop Festival at Monterey, and signed the Experience. They played 5 or 6 days in San Francisco at the Fillmore Auditorium, and then they had some other shows on the West Coast. Earl Warren Showgrounds. They played at the Whiskey A Go-Go. They flew back to New York in early July and played a couple gigs in New York, including one in Central Park on July 5th. And sort of, shockingly, and sort of it was controversial, certainly within the band, but there are other Hendrix was managed by 2 people. They were co-managers. Chaz Chandler, he was the guy that produced Hendrix in the studio, and he was more of the hands-on kind of day-to-day manager, if you will. And then the co-manager was Michael Jeffrey. He was the guy sort of behind the scenes, making deals, and he was sort of the black sheep person in this sort of musical configuration. But anyway, it was Michael Jeffrey who negotiated the tour that Hendrix was going to open up for the Monkees. And I could see where Jeffrey's coming from, with that. Jimmy was breaking new ground. I mean, this was his first time back in the United States. Their debut album, Are You Experienced, hadn't even debuted in the United States. They had some singles that had been played, Purple Haze and The Wind Cries Mary, for singles, but the album itself had not been released in the United States. So the public at large didn't really know much about Hendrix. I mean, obviously the people at Monterey, the people that had seen him play in San Francisco knew who he was. And you know, his friends back in New York obviously knew who he was when he went back to the Village and played some gigs there with his experience. People knew who he was, so it was kind of a nice welcome home. But the Monkees, the Monkees tour, you know, in terms of music, you know, the Monkees were, you know, sort of a really popular band, like a TV pop band, if you will, if you've ever seen that show, the Monkees. You know, and they had some interesting songs like The Last Train to Clarksville. I remember hearing that as a kid and kind of liking it. And I remember seeing that Monkey show, you know, whatever. I mean, anything musical turned me on as a kid, so it wasn't being too critical. But, you know, Jimi Hendrix and his music, you know, the contrast in styles between a, you know, sort of poppy TV kids pop really versus Jimi Hendrix, who was sort of a avant-garde blues, you know, up and coming sort of, you know, psychedelic blues player, right? So it's just two totally different styles of music, but again, you know, going back to economics, a great opportunity for Hendrix to get more exposure, right? Even to the Monkees' parents, who might be accompanying, you know, might be turning on to some of the parents musically, if you will. But apparently the tour did not particularly go that well, and you know, it was just uncomfortable to the point where they basically got off the tour. I think they did 8 shows. Yeah, they did 8 shows total, ending in Forest Hills and Queens, which a year later Hendrix would, you know, fill that stadium on his own. You know, but opening for the Monkees, it was not the greatest situation. So they got off that tour. They played, you know, a couple more gigs, and so now they're basically hanging out in New York City, mostly between late July and early August. They do 3 or 4 nights at the Embassy Theater in Washington, D.C., and between August 9th and August 12th, which is kind of cool if you think about what it's like in DC in the summertime, and great place to be, you know, when you're trying to break new ground. I mean, I think Washington DC is a cool town, and it's just kind of fun to think about Jimmy being there with his band really early, you know, and Noel and Mitch getting a chance to take in some of the historic sites, if you will. Hopefully they did, you know, go exploring when they weren't playing at night. And then from there they did a show in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which I thought is kind of interesting. You know, it's obviously a college town and really kind of foreshadows what Jimmy's early, because after this Hollywood Bowl show, he goes home and they fly back to England, and they don't return back. They don't come back to the U.S. until, not as a band. They don't come back until early February. Where they open up a tour on the West Coast. So this, and then that February tour, you know, it was smaller venues, smaller audiences, a lot of college campus type venues, different ballrooms, things like that. So, you know, so this Ann Arbor gig kind of foreshadows that, and then, you know, which leads us into the Hollywood Bowl show. I'm going to jump right into the set list on the record, and I just wanted to provide some context. The months leading up, so 2 months after Monterey, Jimmy has this opportunity to open up for the Mamas and Papas at the Hollywood Bowl, and so we last heard him at Monterey. Just an incredible concert. I just can't overstate how amazing that is. So I highly recommend it, both on vinyl and certainly on a DVD. The footage is just amazing, so I recommend that. So this is 2 months to the day after Monterey, okay? And let's jump right into it. You know, we hear some radio, you know, there's an MC at the Hollywood Bowl. You know, it's a pretty prestigious gig for the experience. You know, 2 months in the U.S., here they are at, you know, arguably one of America's most famous musical venues, the Hollywood Bowl. So very exciting. There was a sound check earlier in the afternoon. You might be familiar with pictures. You know, I have a Jimi Hendrix book called Sessions, and it's a predecessor to the more recent Ultimate Experience, which is an overview of live Hendrix shows and live shows and studio dates. But in the sessions book, there were some great pictures of the sound check that afternoon at the Hollywood Bowl with Jimi, showing him warming up, and there's a picture of the Vanilla Fudge drummer trying to throw Mitch in the pool, in the reflecting pool. But just, these guys were so young at the time, they were just fooling around. But some great pictures in the afternoon of that sound check. So anyway, getting back to the show, we're at night here. There's some radio MC announcements. And then the MC asks, "Are you ready for a groovy night?" There was probably, I don't really know much about the Mamas and Papas. I know they're more folk, kind of a folk band. But there was some good energy that night. And then he says, "The Jimi Hendrix Experience." So the Jimi and Jimi Hendrix, Mitch Mitchell, and Noel Redding. They open up the show with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a Beatles song. So those in the audience who were familiar with that record had probably owned it for a few months. I think it came out in June of '67. I know that's when it came out in the UK. I'm not sure about the US. But just a cool way to open up the show. And in terms of the mix, Jimmy's vocals are very upfront. Early on, you hear his voice. It seems louder than the guitar. Then you hear Mitch's drums, and I'm talking about the mix. And then you can hear Noel. He's sort of third in the mix, if you will. So it's a great way to open up the show. The next song is called "Killing Floor," and this is the song that Jimi opened up his American debut in Monterey 2 months prior. This is a different version. In this one, we hear there's an intro which sounds like versions of "Are You Experienced" that we would hear later on in '68 and '69, especially where he would do these, 2 to 3, sometimes up to 5 minutes, just him sort of free-forming it, if you will, and playing, Eastern sounding scales. And so there's a touch of that here before "Killing Floor," and then he goes right into the opening riff and changes. Really strong vocals on this one. This is a great Jimi song, a great cover of Howling Wolf. Noel is much more prominent in the mix at this point. Maybe, I don't know what they were doing backstage, adjusting levels or whatnot, but I was hearing him better. Jimi plays a pretty strong solo. Again, more growling vocals by Jimi, and he kind of ends it with some nice feedback. And then he says thanks anyway. Like, maybe he didn't get the greatest response from the audience, but it's the second song, and like I said before, not a lot of people knew who he was. There were people in the audience who did know, but for a lot of people, this was just like Monterey. This was a new experience for a lot of people. And then Jimi says, going into the next song, "This one's dedicated to everybody whose first name is Mary," something along those lines, and he goes into "The Wind Cries Mary." And to me, this was a real highlight of the album. You can hear Jimmy's country. You can hear the time Jimi lived in Tennessee for a few years, and he lived in Clarksdale, and I think he lived in Nashville as well. And Nashville is quite a musical town, even back when he lived there in the '60s, early to mid '60s. But you can hear that country music, sort of that. To me, it sounds like a Nashville ballad. And there were some miscues on some verses. I don't know what was happening there. Why Jimi missed some of the verse cues there. But the solo was just a near album perfect solo, really replicating what you'd hear on the album. I thought Mitch was playing really amazing underneath. And you'll probably hear me say that a lot in this review. Mitch Mitchell was a phenomenal drummer and foil for Jimi. I mean, the things that he was doing on the drums, and you think about the size of his kit. He had a very small kit. It was before the double bass kit that he used in 1969. In 1967, he just had one floor, one bass drum, a snare, maybe one up here, and just maybe 3 or 4 drums total. I mean, it was just really bare bones, but he got so much out of it. He was such a dynamic player. So he's doing some great things underneath here in The Wind Cries Mary. And Jimmy's just playing really great guitar in this one. He throws in some really nice cordial stylings, if you will, in the outro. And the crowd, you can actually hear the crowd. They obviously appreciated it. The next song he goes right into Foxey Lady. This is a charged version. There's a great solo by Jimmy. Again, Mitch playing really well on his kit. And then you can hear Noel coming in. Noel would provide background vocals. So in Foxey Lady, you could hear him singing Foxy pretty prominently in every other soundboard from here all the way through, until Noel drops out of the experience. You can hear him singing Foxy pretty prominently, and it starts here on this recording. So absolutely one of Noel's more famous vocal lines, if you will. And then, at the end of this, Jimmy just says, "Thank you very much," kind of abruptly, like he, again, maybe wasn't feeling it with the audience. And then the next song, which again, besides The Wind Cries Mary, I thought this was a real highlight of the set, is Catfish Blues. This was, Jimmy talks about something done by muddy waters. But he always said they like to do it their own way, the experienced way. At one point, Jimmy explained, he's going, "Oh yeah," and I think that's typical in the song. And I wanted to mention, I've heard a lot of versions of Catfish Blues in 1967, and this really was, before Red House became extended, before we heard "Hear My Train a Comin'," that would come in '68. But at the time, in '67, Catfish Blues really was, Jimmy's like blues. And in his sets, it really was sort of the blues centerpiece, if you will. So it is in this show and it is in other shows, but it's such a great. I mean, practically every version I've heard from '67, excuse me, and even early '67, they're all amazing versions. So I if you happen to come across a version, definitely check it out. So Jimmy's really having fun here in this version. He's laughing, and when during the "my girlfriend's house" line, he kind of laughs. He takes his first solo, and Mitch is again playing really well. Jimmy brings it back. Jimmy solos for a little bit. He brings it back down to the first position, so the notes are lower and sort of chunkier, if you will. Things kind of level out. And then Mitch actually takes a pretty cool drum solo, and he's really just knocking it out of the park. And then actually, this is kind of surprising me, but then Noel starts to chime in on his bass after Mitch takes a pretty nice drum solo. Definitely worth hearing. Again, Mitch Mitchell is just incredible. So Noel comes in, and frankly, I was surprised how well Noel's playing. I'm sort of critical of Noel at times. This time he comes in really nicely. He's more patient as Mitch is kind of winding up his drum solo. And then Jimmy comes back in with some wah-wah infused guitar lines. And then the music gets sort of watery and into this sort of different kind of space. Jimmy comes back in with more single note lines. To me at this point, it almost sounds like pre-Voodoo Child, the slow blues. Not child, but child, Chile. Hearing just hints of that. And then Jimmy sort of ends it on an ascending cordial progression, if you will. And then at the end, Noel says, "Mitch on drums there." So I could sense that Noel was trying to, show support for Mitch and really let the audience know that, our drummer's name is Mitch Mitchell, and I like that they're really supporting each other. Flipping the record over the show. This is a single set show, but on side 2, The set continues with Fire. And this show was not played at Monterey, which I thought was kind of interesting when I was taking notes on this release. But it is played here, and it's a great version. Jimmy says he'd like to dedicate this to everybody, and kind of laughs a little bit. Again, Jimmy's vocals, he's really charged vocally. Just a great solo by Jimmy and Mitch. This is Mitch's song. I mean, I know I keep talking about Mitch, but if there's one song that really personifies Mitchell, it is Fire, because his drumming is just incendiary. He certainly is here. And there's some really nice outro bends by Jimmy on his solo, and he closes it with some nice feedback, and it's sort of embryonic, and this is really where the overall theme of the show is that a lot of the music is embryonic, right? Their album hasn't been released. They've been playing together as a band 10 months, almost 10 months, but with their music would evolve immensely over the next 2 years. We'll kind of touch base on that, but when he's ending songs and there's feedback, you can hear it. I mean, it's cool. It's definitely one of his signature, but it's so embryonic. It's not like it would become in a year or two where he would do these just incredible feedback. He'd end a song and it would sound just, so it's again embryonic of that. And then they go into Like a Rolling Stone. And this one, I thought this was an interesting version. I've heard, again, some different versions over 1967 leading up to this point. And this one, to me, had a faster pace, just sounded faster. Some versions can be slower. Some can be almost laconic. But this one was pretty fast. Jimmy's got some nice lines in between verses. The entire band, they sound pretty charged as they head into the chorus, and Jimmy's navigating some of those lyrics. Some of the lyrics almost have sort of a hip hop style in their fast delivery. How does it feel? Just Jimmy loves playing this song, and I think I'm not a huge Dylan fan. I don't really know a whole lot about Dylan, but I mean, I love Jimmy's version. I love the way that he plays Like a Rolling Stone, and it's probably my favorite version of the song, just like All Along the Watchtower. But so he does a great job here at the Hollywood Bowl, and I think certainly in Jimmy's audience, which was more sort of underground, more avant-garde, more AM radio at the time, if you will, more hippie-ish at the time, if you will. I think a lot of those fans are into Dylan. And so I think that was, Hendrix was able to sort of connect with audiences when he played Dylan songs. I think people really appreciated that. And certainly this is true here with Like a Rolling Stone. It's interesting, the way the song ended, they sounded unsure of how to end it, and then there was some loud feedback. So I don't know, I've heard them end it perfectly fine, but here tonight it sounded like they were struggling in terms of how to end it. So I thought that was interesting. The next song is Purple Haze. Again, Mitch is really charged, and you can hear Jimmy playing his outro solo with his teeth. It's so audible. He definitely practiced that. So the next song and the last song to close it out is Wild Thing. And so he's closing out almost every show with Wild Thing, probably at this point. This was before Voodoo Child. Voodoo Child became his big closer, probably for all of, maybe half of late 68, all of 69 and 70, probably 90% of the time he ended shows with Voodoo Child. But before that, he ended shows with Wild Thing, which is what we have here. And then so before he ends, he dedicates this to soldiers coming in, and he talks about instead of carrying M16s, they should be carrying drums and guitars, and so it's kind of interesting. Jimmy was in the Army himself, so he knew Vietnam was not a good scene, and having been in the Army, probably some of the guys that he was in the army with ended up going to Vietnam and potentially maybe not even coming back. So that was always a sort of a stark reality for Jimmy, because he was discharged, and that could have easily been his fate as well. Again, just like in Killing Floor, he does this sort of Eastern sounding "Are You Experienced" kind of intro. Then he goes right into the chords. He does this kind of funny thing, and if you know about Hendrix, he does this "Pop the Weasel" when he's doing Wild Thing after "You Move You" line. Like he'll go "You move you" and then does the "Pop the Weasel," but it's very audible. And then, like the Monterey version, which is the version he set his guitar on fire, here he quotes Frank Sinatra's "Strangers in the Night," which is kind of cool. I think that's, in the context of, playing at a new venue, he's everyone there is a stranger in the night. So it's kind of just a cool little tease there. And then some freeform jamming kind of emerges from that section. And then Jimmy brings it back, does a couple more verses. He says thank you very much, and then after that there's more sort of chaos musically. Maybe there's some guitar smashing. It's hard to really discern what's going on, but it's definitely chaos, and you can hear Mitch and Noel. They're still just going at it hard. Mitch is hitting the cymbals hard, and Noel's just flying on his bass. And then you can hear a final "thank you very much," and then the MC comes in with the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and that pretty much ends the show. So nothing too extraordinary. Musically, the intros to Killing Floor and Wild Thing were interesting and sort of foreshadow what we will hear later on in Are You Experienced live versions. The Wind Cries Mary was just a beautiful song, and Jimmy stopped playing The Wind Cries Mary probably after early to mid 1968. You didn't really hear it that often at live shows. These early versions are great, and it really, I think, in terms of a ballad, Jimmy would probably play Little Wing, for example, later on, but early on he played The Wind Cries Mary, and great rhythm guitar and lead playing in that song. The other highlight, again, for me was Catfish Blues. And both Jimmy and Mitch are just unhinged. And I'm sure Noel is as well, but you just don't hear him as well in the mix. But like I said, all versions that I've heard from 1967, Catfish Blues are great. Fire, that's another great version. Like a Rolling Stone, just to me it sounded a little faster, but kind of unique in that sense. But nothing that really stuck out on that. And I just want to say that overall it was kind of an average show compared to the last time we heard him, which was in Monterey, and that was just an incredibly special show and under a completely different set of circumstances. But this show, the Hollywood Bowl, it fills an interesting gap between Monterey and before this release, the next soundboard. There's some stuff that was released on Stages, the Jimi Hendrix Stages box set. There was a show from September of '67 on that. So, but that's a pretty significant gap from mid-June '67 all the way to early September. And this show, and then the next soundboard we hear is from Paris, October 9th or 10th and that's a really good show. Almost a year to the day when he debuted at the Paris Olympia. That's the next soundboard. So this Hollywood Bowl show, and the Experience would fly home a couple days after this show. But it's a nice snapshot of Jimmy at the end of 2 months of being in the U.S. from Monterey Pop to essentially a 2-month period where he played, here and there, and he would come back in early 1968 and almost toured the entire year of 1968. Kind continuing to lay groundwork. But again, it's just sort of an average show, and you think about how his music would evolve over the next 2 years. These versions again, and I use the word embryonic because that's what we hear here. We're just hearing some real embryonic versions, right? But it would all expand immensely. And I just wanted to mention, you think about 2 years, right? So this was August 18th, 1967. And then 2 years to the day ahead, that's when Jimmy's playing at Woodstock with a brand new band, Gypsy Suns and Rainbows. He's playing with Billy Cox. He's playing with Larry Lee, his friends that he met in the Army. And Mitch is in the band and some other percussionists. But just a new band and a new Jimmy. So 2 years from this Monterey to Woodstock. A lot of musical changes for Jimmy, but it's just kind of interesting to think about. And I think it's also cool. I just want to say in closing that this Hollywood Bowl show, there's some really cool Hendrix releases in Los Angeles, right? You've got this new release, right? That's August 18th, 1967. When Electric Ladyland was re-released a few years ago, there was included in that box set was a live show from September 14th, 1968, where he opens with, I want to say Are You Experienced, but I know he plays Voodoo Child. It's just literally a week or two before the release of Electric Ladyland. So it's interesting that to compare these two shows, a week before the album, right? The show, the Hollywood Bowl, it's a week before Are You Experienced, and then a year later they're back headlining the Hollywood Bowl before the release of Electric Ladyland. And then the third LA show is in April of 1969 at the LA Forum, and that was a pretty recent release by the Experience Hendrix LLC. That's the family company's name that do these great releases that we all appreciate. But they released the LA Forum show, which is a great. So you've got the Hollywood Bowl 67, Hollywood Bowl 68, LA Forum 69, which is a great show. There is a show from 70, LA Forum 70, but it's an audience recording. I haven't heard anything about anything. I haven't heard any soundboard recordings, and I've heard some of that. I've listened to some of that LA Forum 70 show. There's quite a few audience recordings and merges of different audience recordings. So rich history of music in LA for Hendrix. And just to recap, I recommend this album. I recommend everything I review, obviously, but definitely, I'm a huge Hendrix fan, and again, you're not going to hear, mind-blowing versions like you will on the Band of Gypsies box set, for example. But still, it's just great music, right? I mean, any new music from Hendrix is at this point is unrivaled. It's just, it's a blessing. It's a treasure. So and it gives us Hendrix fans just more stuff to talk about and obsess about. And I wanted to close the show. I thought this was a cool picture because you think about the show I think Hendrix was having fun, but I think it was probably a tough show for them. They killed it. They killed it. But so this is a picture. This is a picture of Hendrix playing pool at the end of the show at Michelle and John Phillips' house after the show. He's clearly having fun. He's smiling, wearing the same clothes. So just wanted to share that with you guys. And that was after the show at the Hollywood Bowl. So that concludes this week. I know it's kind of a long-winded one, but again, I love Hendrix. So love to see some comments too, guys. If you have you want to talk about this show or anything that I talked about this period between Monterey and Hollywood Bowl, because it really is an interesting 2-month period when Jimmy comes back after having been in England for 8 months with his band and having tremendous success in England. You know, he's by the time he comes back to the U.S. and in June of 1967, I mean, he's practically an international star because he has a huge fan. He's already got a huge fan base in the UK, you know, and Europe. He's played in Germany and he's played in other parts. He's played in France. So, you know, so he comes home and still no one really knows him, right? Except for these small, you know, the musicians that he played with, right? Like the soul bands that he played with and the musicians that he played with in New York before he left. I mean, people knew who he was, but not on a mass level. You know, again, just check it out, and thanks for tuning in. Okay, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.